A long time ago in Europe, there was a royal wedding between Princess Isabella and Prince Thierry. It was supposed to be a happy event to bring two powerful families together, but instead, something terrible happened. Many people were killed. Ease what are higher from our self-safety, so complete, so calculated, that it would forever change how royalty approached their most sacred ceremonies. This is not merely a tale of murder, but of political annihilation, carried out with such precision that an entire bloodline was erased in the span of a single evening. The year was 1387, and Europe stood at a crossroads. The 100 Years' War had ravaged France, while the Iberian Peninsula simmered with dynastic conflicts that threatened to tear kingdoms apart. It was against this backdrop of uncertainty and violence that the marriage between Isabella and Thierry was arranged, a union that promised to bring stability to a continent drowning in its own blood. Instead, it would add more names to the ever-growing list of the dead. The wedding took place at the castle of Malance, a fortress that straddled the border between Catalonia and Aragon. Its white walls, which had witnessed centuries of conflict, would soon bear witness to one of history's most sinister acts of political murder. For within those walls, beneath the banners of celebration, and amidst the sounds of revelry, death was being carefully measured and served in crystal goblets. What makes this tragedy particularly haunting is not just the scale of the deaths, though estimates suggest that between 40 and 60 nobles perished that night, but the methodical nature of the poisoning. This was no crime of passion, no spontaneous act of vengeance. The evidence suggests months, perhaps years of planning went into ensuring that when the sun rose on that September morning, an entire political faction would be nothing more than corpses awaiting burial. The prime suspect, King Henry of Tustamura, Isabella's own uncle, had everything to gain from the massacre. The alliance between Castile and Burgundy threatened his grip on power, potentially creating a rival claim to territories he had spent decades securing. But Henry was far from the only one with motive. The web of medieval politics was tangled with grievances, ambitions, and blood feuds that stretched back generations. Today, as we look back across more than 6 centuries, the poisoned wedding stands as a grim reminder of the lengths to which those in power will go to maintain their position. It speaks to a time when trust was a luxury few could afford, and when accepting an invitation to celebrate could be signing one's own death warrant. The ripples from that night spread across Europe, fundamentally altering how nobility approached everything from diplomatic marriages to simple shared meals. This is the story of how a wedding became a funeral, how celebration turned to horror, and how the quest for power transformed a sacred union into an instrument of mass murder. It is a tale that deserves to be remembered not for its darkness alone, but for what it teaches us about the price of ambition and the fragility of trust in the corridors of power. The late 14th century was a period of profound transformation across Europe. The Black Death had swept through the continent just decades earlier, killing anywhere from 30 to 60% of the population. This demographic catastrophe had upended the social order, creating opportunities for ambitious nobles to seize lands and titles that would have been beyond their reach in more stable times. It was an era when fortunes could be made or lost in a single battle, when alliances shifted like sand, and when blood ties offered little protection against the blade of ambition. Castile, in particular, was a kingdom born from conflict and sustained by it. The recent civil war between Pedro the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara had left deep scars across the landscape and in the hearts of the nobility. Henry's victory had come at a terrible price. He had murdered his own brother to claim the throne, earning him the eternal enmity of Pedro's supporters and creating a precedent for fratricide that would haunt Castilian politics for generations. The Kingdom of Burgundy, meanwhile, represented a different kind of power, where Castile's strength lay in its warriors and its willingness to wage war. Burgundy had grown wealthy through trade and careful diplomacy. The Burgundian court was renowned across Europe for its sophistication, its patronage of the arts, and its political acumen. Prince Thierry, at 23, embodied these qualities. He was said to be as comfortable negotiating trade agreements as he was leading cavalry charges. The marriage alliance between these two powers made perfect strategic sense for Castile. It offered access to Burgundy's trade networks and a potential ally against France. For Burgundy, It provided a foothold in the Iberian Peninsula and a hedge against the ambitions of the French crown. But in the chess game of medieval politics, every move created counter-moves, and this alliance threatened too many existing power structures to go unchallenged. Henry of Tristamura, now in his 50s and increasingly paranoid about threats to his rule, saw the marriage as nothing less than an existential threat. His claim to the Castilian throne remained contested by supporters of Pedro the Cruel's descendants, many of whom had fled to Burgundy and other foreign courts. The prospect of his niece marrying into a family that harbored his enemies was intolerable. Moreover, any children from the union would have claims to both Castilian and Burgundian territories, creating a power block that could challenge his own descendants. The choice of Mont Blanc Castle as the wedding venue was itself laden with political significance. The fortress had changed hands multiple times during the various conflicts that had swept through the region, and its current lord, Count Ramon de Prades, was known for his careful neutrality.
This neutrality, which should have made the castle a safe haven for the celebration, would ultimately make it the perfect killing ground, a place where multiple factions could operate without immediately arousing suspicion. In the months leading up to the wedding, a steady stream of nobles, merchants, and diplomats made their way to Mont Blanc. The guest list read like a who's who of European nobility, with representatives from France, England, Aragon, Nava, and even the Italian city-states. Each arrival brought their own retinue, their own agendas, and in at least one case, their own deadly plans. The castle of Mont Blanc had never seen such splendor as it did in the week leading up to the wedding. Silk banners in the colors of Castile and Burgundy fluttered from every tower, while the Great Hall was transformed into a wonderland of gold and silver decorations. The kitchens worked around the clock, preparing delicacies that would showcase the wealth and sophistication of both kingdoms. Musicians practiced in the courtyards, their melodies mixing with the sound of arriving guests and the bustle of final preparations. Princess Isabella arrived 3 days before the ceremony, accompanied by a procession that stretched for nearly a mile. At 19, she was considered one of the great beauties of her generation, with the dark hair and eyes characteristic of Castilian nobility, and a bearing that spoke of her royal blood. Those who saw her during those final days would later recall a young woman full of life and hope, eagerly anticipating her union with a prince she had corresponded with but never met. Prince Thierry's arrival the following day was no less grand. The Burgundian party brought with them gifts that dazzled even the jaded nobility. Fine wines, exquisite tapestries, and jewels that caught the light like captured stars. Thierry himself cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of a man who had never known defeat. The initial meeting between the bride and groom, carefully choreographed according to the customs of the time, seemed to confirm what everyone hoped, that this was not just a political match, but one that might actually bring happiness to both parties. The wedding ceremony itself took place in the castle's chapel. On the morning of September 15th, the Archbishop of Tagana presided, reading from an illuminated manuscript that had been specially commissioned for the occasion. Isabella wore a gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread, while Thierry was resplendent in purple velvet trimmed with mat. As they exchanged vows, witnessed by the assembled nobility of half of Europe, no one could have imagined that they were watching the beginning of the end. Following the ceremony, with lower tables arranged according to strict protocols of rank and precedence, this attention to hierarchy, meant to prevent disputes and honor traditions, would ultimately make the poisoner's task easier, allowing them to target specific groups with deadly accuracy. The feast began at noon and was planned to continue well into the night. The first courses were brought out with great ceremony. Soups flavored with exotic spices, roasted swans, resplendent with their feathers replaced, and elaborate pastries shaped like castles and ships. Wine flowed freely, with servants ensuring that no cup remained empty for long. It was during the third course, as the main dishes were being served, that the first signs of trouble appeared. Count Fernando Duna,
seated at one of the tables reserved for Castilian nobility, was the first to show symptoms. Witnesses would later describe how he suddenly clutched at his throat, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. Before anyone could react, he had fallen from his chair, convulsing on the rush-strewn floor. Within moments, similar scenes were playing out across the hall as guest after guest began to succumb to whatever poison had been introduced into the feast. The poison used that night remains a subject of debate among historians and toxicologists. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms consistent with several different substances. The rapid onset suggests something like cyanide derived from bitter almonds or cherry laurel, while the convulsions and paralysis point toward hemlock or wolfsbane. What seems certain is that multiple poisons were employed, carefully calibrated to ensure maximum lethality, while providing enough time for the perpetrators to make their escape. The Great Hall, moments before filled with music and laughter, transformed into a scene from hell itself. Nobles clutched at their throats, gasping for air that would not come. Others writhed on the floor in agony, their fine clothes soaked with sweat, and worse, the screams of the dying mixed with the shouts of those trying desperately to help, creating a cacophony of terror that echoed through the castle's stone corridors. At the high table, the scene was no less horrific. Prince Thierry was among the first to fall, blood frothing from his lips as the poison ravaged his system. Isabella, who had initially rushed to her new husband's side, soon succumbed herself, collapsing across his body in a grotesque parody of marital embrace. The Archbishop, who had blessed their union mere hours before, fell to his knees in prayer before the poison claimed him as well. The chaos that followed defied all attempts at order. Some of the unaffected guests tried to help the victims, forcing fingers down throats to induce vomiting or carrying the stricken outside for fresh air. Others, recognizing the magnitude of what was happening, fled the castle entirely, fearing that they might be next. Guards rushed to seal the gates, unsure whether they were trying to trap a poisoner inside or prevent more killers from entering. By the time the sun set on that terrible day, the Great Hall had become a charnel house. Bodies lay where they had fallen, the elaborate feast now a macabre still life of death and abandoned luxury. The exact count of the dead would take days to determine, as servants and lesser nobles who had consumed leftovers continued to succumb to the poison's effects. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at 43 nobles of various ranks, not counting the numerous servants and retainers who also perished. Among the dead were some of the most powerful figures in European politics. Besides the bride and groom, the victims included the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Count of Benvente, 3 bishops, and numerous knights and ladies whose bloodlines stretched back to the Reconquista. In a single afternoon, entire noble houses were extinguished, leaving behind power vacuums that would take years to fill, and precipitating conflicts that would claim many more lives. One of the most chilling aspects of the massacre was the testimony of Lady Beatriz de Mendoza, one of the few members of the High Table to survive. Too ill to eat much at the feast, due to a persistent stomach ailment, she witnessed the deaths of everyone around her while remaining largely unaffected. Her account, preserved in the archives of the Cathedral of Toledo, provides our most detailed description of those horrific hours. I watched as my cousin Isabella's face transformed from joy to confusion to terror. Lady Beatriz would later testify she reached for Prince Thierry as he fell, and I saw her realize what was happening. She looked directly at me, and in her eyes was not just fear of death, but the terrible knowledge of betrayal. She knew in those final moments that someone she trusted had done this to her. The survival of certain individuals raised immediate suspicions. Why had some escaped the fate that befell so many others? The pattern of deaths suggested that the poisoner had intimate knowledge of the seating arrangements and the serving protocols. They knew which dishes would be served to which tables, which wines would be offered to the most honored guests. This was not the work of an outsider outsider, but of someone within the trust circle of the wedding planners. Suspicion immediately fell upon King Henry of Trastamara, though he was conspicuously absent from the wedding, claiming illness. His absence, which had initially been seen as a diplomatic slight, now appeared far more sinister. Several of his most trusted agents had been present at the feast. When questioned, they claimed to have been fasting for religious reasons, an explanation that struck many as conveniently timed. Other suspects emerged as the investigation progressed. The Count of Foix, who had long-standing disputes with both Castilian and Burgundian interests, had left the castle shortly before the feast began, claiming urgent business. Several Italian merchants, representatives of banking houses that stood to lose considerably from a Castile-Burgundy alliance, had been seen in deep conversation with the kitchen staff in the days before the wedding. Even more troubling were the accounts of a mysterious woman, described by several witnesses as wearing the habit of a nun, but moving with the bearing of nobility. She had been seen in various parts of the castle in the days leading up to the wedding, but vanished completely on the day of the feast. Some speculated she was an agent of the French crown, others that she was connected to supporters of the late Pedro the Cruel, seeking revenge against the trust line. The investigation that followed was hampered by the political chaos the poisoning had created. With so many nobles dead, their vassals and allies immediately moved to secure their holdings, leading to numerous small conflicts that distracted from the pursuit of justice. The various kingdoms affected formed their own investigative committees, often working across purposes and jealously guarding whatever evidence they uncovered. Confessions extracted under torture provided contradictory accounts that led nowhere. A kitchen servant admitted to accepting a bribe to add a special spice to certain dishes, but died under questioning before revealing who had paid him. A wine merchant confessed to providing specific bottles for specific tables, but claimed he believed he was merely fulfilling special dietary requirements. The trail of evidence led in circles, each revelation raising more questions than it answered. The immediate aftermath of the poisoned wedding sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. Within days, emergency councils were convened from London to Rome as monarchs and nobles grappled with the implications of what had occurred. If such a massacre could happen at a carefully planned royal wedding, what event was safe? The very foundations of diplomatic culture built on the assumption of certain inviolable customs and protections had been shattered. King Henry of Trastamara's response to the tragedy was telling. While he proclaimed his shock and horror at the events, he moved with remarkable speed to consolidate the territories that would have been affected by the Castile-Burgundy alliance. Within a month, he had installed his own supporters in key positions left vacant by the massacre, and negotiated new treaties that largely negated the threat. Thierry's father never recovered from the loss of his son and heir. He spent his remaining years obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the poisoning, spending vast sums on spies and informants who produced many theories but no definitive answers. The Burgundian court, once known for its openness and cultural sophistication, became paranoid and insular. Perhaps the most lasting impact was on the culture of royal and noble gatherings. Throughout Europe, almost immediately, new protocols were established for protecting against poisoning. Official tasters, who had often been ceremonial figures, now became essential parts of any formal meal. The practice of the host eating first from every dish served to guests became mandatory. Some courts went so far as to require guests to bring their own food and wine, leading to awkward and tense gatherings where trust was visibly absent. The Catholic Church, having lost 3 bishops and numerous other clergy in the massacre, issued new edicts regarding the protection of religious figures at secular events. Papal investigators were dispatched to examine the evidence, and their report, though never made fully public, was said to contain damning allegations against several crowned heads of Europe. The Church's influence in mediating between kingdoms already weakened by the Avignon papacy suffered another blow, from which it would not soon recover. The tragedy also spurred developments in what would eventually become the science of toxicology. Physicians and alchemists across Europe began systematic studies of poisons and their effects, seeking both to understand what had happened at Milank and to prevent future occurrences. The University of Paris established a special committee to study toxic substances, while Italian city-states with their reputation for sophisticated poisoning found their expertise suddenly in high demand. New diplomatic protocols emerged from the ashes of Montblanc. Wedding negotiations now included elaborate provisions for security and food safety. Guest lists were scrutinized with new intensity, and the tradition of hostage exchanges, where each party would send trusted family members to the other's court during negotiations, became standard practice. The age of innocent celebration was over, replaced by an era of systematic suspicion. The economic ramifications of the massacre rippled outward, like waves from a stone dropped in a pond. Trade routes that had been secured by the anticipated alliance fell into dispute. Banking houses that had extended credit based on expected political stability found themselves facing default. The Medici Bank alone was said to have lost the equivalent of several years' profit due to loans that could not be collected from dead nobles' estates. Legal disputes arising from the poisoning continued for generations, with so many nobles dying simultaneously, often without clear heirs. Succession crises erupted across multiple kingdoms. Some of these disputes led to minor wars, others to legal battles that enriched lawyers while impoverishing the estates they were meant to protect. The concept of corruption of blood, where the crimes of one generation tainted their descendants, was invoked both by those seeking to claim estates and those trying to defend them. The poisoned wedding also entered popular culture with remarkable speed. Within months, ballads about the tragedy were being sung in taverns across Europe. These songs, often wildly inaccurate in their details, nonetheless captured the horror and betrayal that the event represented. Traveling performers incorporated the story into their repertoires, using it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the fragility of trust. More sophisticated literary treatments followed. The Chronicle of the Black Feast, written by an anonymous monk, claimed to be a survivor, provided lurid details that historians now believe to be largely fabricated, but which shaped popular perception of the event for centuries. Dante's lesser-known contemporary Czech Doskali incorporated references to the poisoning in his works, using it as an example of divine justice against the proud and ambitious. The visual arts also grappled with the tragedy. A fresco in the Cathedral of Barcelona, painted within a decade of the event, shows the feast hall at the moment of revelation, with angels and demons battling over the souls of the dying. The artist's decision to depict some victims ascending to heaven, while others are dragged to hell, reflected the complex moral judgments that contemporaries made about those involved. Perhaps most significantly, the poisoned wedding became a touchstone for political theorists. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing more than a century later, would reference it as an example of effective, if immoral, statecraft. The elimination of multiple rivals in a single stroke, he argued, showed a brutal efficiency that, while morally reprehensible, achieved its political objectives with minimal broader conflict. The legends that grew up around the event often diverged significantly from the historical record. Stories of ghostly banquets where the dead nobles gathered to reenact their final feast became common in the region around Massacre. The castle itself, abandoned within a generation of the poisoning, became known as a cursed place, where the walls wept blood on the anniversary of the massacre. One persistent legend concerned the fate of the mysterious nun-like figure seen before the wedding. According to various versions of the tale, she was alternately a wronged lover seeking revenge, a witch in service to dark powers, or even Isabella herself, traveling back through time to witness her own doom. While historians dismiss such tales, they reflect the deep psychological impact the event had on the medieval imagination. The search for definitive proof of who orchestrated the poisoning continued for decades. In 1423, a deathbed confession by Garcia de Padilla, one of King Henry's closest advisors, seemed to confirm royal involvement. However, the confession was obtained under suspicious circumstances, and some historians believe it was fabricated by Henry's enemies to posthumously blacken his reputation. More intriguing was the discovery in 1456 of a cache of documents hidden in the walls of a monastery near Malanque. Among these papers were what appeared to be plans for the poisoning, including lists of victims and notes on various toxic substances. However, the documents were written in a cipher that has never been fully decoded, and their authenticity remains disputed. Some scholars believe they were planted later to implicate certain parties, while others see them as genuine evidence of the conspiracy. Modern forensic historians have attempted to apply contemporary investigative techniques to the available evidence. Analysis of the patterns of death, the timing of symptoms, and the distribution of victims has led to new theories about the method of poisoning. Some now believe that multiple poisoners were involved, working independently but toward the same goal, a convergence of conspiracies rather than a single master plan. The question of motive remains equally complex. While King Henry of Trastamara had obvious reasons to fear the alliance, other parties stood to benefit from the chaos. The French crown, engaged in its long struggle with England, may have seen the prevention of a strong Castile-Burgundy axis as essential to its survival. Italian banking houses, facing potential loss of influence in Iberian trade, had both motive and means. Even within Castile and Burgundy, there were factions that opposed the marriage for their own reasons. Recent archaeological excavations at Malanque have yielded new evidence that may shed light on the events of that fatal day. Analysis of pottery fragments from the kitchen areas has revealed traces of several toxic substances, including compounds not previously associated with the poisoning. The discovery of a hidden passage connecting the kitchens to an external exit suggests that the poisoners had prepared an escape route well in advance. DNA analysis of remains believed to be those of some victims has confirmed the presence of multiple toxins in their systems. This supports the theory that the poisoning was even more complex than contemporary accounts suggested, with different poisons used for different victims to ensure maximum lethality. While confusing any investigation, the legacy of the poisoned wedding extends far beyond the immediate political consequences. It marked a turning point in European court culture, from one based on ideals of chivalry and honor to one dominated by suspicion and realpolitik. The massacre demonstrated that traditional protections, sacred hospitality, religious sanction, family bonds, meant nothing in the face of raw ambition. For the science of toxicology, Malanque became a grim laboratory that advanced understanding of poisons by decades. The detailed accounts of symptoms, the variety of substances apparently used, and the different rates of effect on victims provided a wealth of data for those studying toxic substances. Treatises on poison detection and prevention, drawing heavily on the lessons of the poisoned wedding, became standard texts in royal libraries. The event also influenced the development of international law, the concept that certain acts were so heinous they transcended normal political considerations. What would eventually evolve into crimes against humanity can trace some of its roots to the universal revulsion felt at the Malanque Massacre. The idea that there should be standards of conduct that even enemies must observe gains strength from the horror of the poisoned feast. Culturally, the poisoned wedding became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal. References to it appeared in literature, art, and political discourse. For centuries, Shakespeare, though he never directly dramatized the event, incorporated elements of it into several of his tragedies. The image of the poisoned cup offered in friendship but dealing death became a standard metaphor for treachery. The Catholic Church's response to the massacre had long-lasting theological implications. The debate over whether whether those who died at the feast could be considered martyrs. They had died at a celebration blessed by the church after all, led to complex discussions about the nature of martyrdom and divine justice. Some theologians argued that the massacre was God's judgment on the pride and ambition of the nobility, while others saw it as a test of faith that the victims had passed by dying in a state of grace. Even today, historians continue to debate the true nature of what happened at Mlenk. Was it a carefully orchestrated political assassination, or did multiple conspiracies converge by chance? Were there warnings that were ignored, or was the security of the time simply inadequate to prevent such an attack? The abundance of theories and the lack of definitive proof ensure that the poisoned wedding remains one of history's most compelling, unsolved mysteries. For those who study the darker chapters of human history, the massacre at Mont Blanc serves as a reminder of the depths to which political ambition can drive human beings. It demonstrates that no gathering, no matter how sacred or joyful, is immune from the calculations of those who seek power. The image of nobles raising poisoned cups in toast to a young couple's happiness, unknowingly drinking to their own doom, captures something essential about the nature of political violence. The story of Isabella and Tierry themselves often gets lost in the larger political narrative. They were young people, barely out of their teens, who had corresponded for months before their meeting.
In making their political marriage work on a personal level, their deaths cut short not just a political alliance, but what might have been a genuine partnership in their final moments as the poison coursed through their veins. Did they understand what was happening? Did they realize that their union meant to bring peace and prosperity had instead triggered their murder? The image of them dying in each other's arms, whether accurate or romantically embellished by later chroniclers, speaks to the human cost of political machination. They were not just pawns removed from a chessboard, but young lives cut short by the ambitions of others. The broader human toll extended far beyond the noble victims. Servants who had spent their lives in loyal service died alongside their masters. Children were orphaned, wives widowed, entire households destroyed. The economic disruption caused by the sudden death of so many nobles led to hardship for countless common people who depended on noble patronage and protection. Villages that had sent representatives to serve at the wedding found themselves bereft of leadership and vulnerable to bandits and rival lords. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. Many of those who escaped the poisoning never fully recovered from the trauma of watching friends and family die in agony around them. Some retreated to monasteries or convents, seeking spiritual solace for horrors they could not forget. Others became obsessed with security, turning their homes into fortresses and trusting no one. The poison had killed more than bodies. It had murdered innocence and trust. For medieval Europe, the poisoned wedding represented a loss of innocence comparable in its way to the Black Death, where the plague had shown the vulnerability of human life to disease. Mont Blanc demonstrated the vulnerability of civilization itself to human malice. The carefully constructed social orders, the bonds of loyalty and honor that supposedly held society together, had proven powerless against a well-planned act of treachery. As we reflect on these events from the distance of centuries, what lessons can we draw? The poisoned wedding reminds us that power corrupts, not just those who wield it, but those who seek it. It shows us that the pursuit of political advantage can override the most basic human compassion. It demonstrates that technological advancement, in this case the sophisticated use of poisons, without moral advancement, leads only to more efficient methods of destruction. The tragedy also speaks to the importance of justice, even when it seems impossible to achieve. The fact that the perpetrators of the Mont Blanc massacre were never definitively identified or punished created a wound in the European consciousness that never fully healed.
The lack of closure, the absence of justice allowed the event to fester in memory and legend, becoming larger and more terrible with each retelling. Perhaps most importantly,
The poisoned wedding serves as a warning about the fragility of the institutions we depend upon.
the customs of hospitality, the sanctity of religious ceremonies, the bonds of kinship, all were swept aside in pursuit of political gain. When we allow ambition to override humanity, when we prioritize power over people, we risk creating our own versions of Mont Blanc. Today, as we face our own challenges of political division and institutional breakdown, the story of that terrible feast resonates with renewed relevance. It reminds us that civilization is not a given, but a choice we must make daily. Every time we choose trust over suspicion, cooperation over conflict, we reject the path that led to Mamlao. Every time we prioritize human life and dignity over political advantage, we honor the memory of those who died. The castle of Mamlao still stands, though much reduced from its medieval grandeur. Visitors report a sense of unease within its walls, particularly in the ruins of the Great Hall where the feast took place. Local tradition holds that on quiet September nights, you can still hear the echoes of that last toast, the clink of crystal that preceded screams. Whether true or not, such stories serve as reminders that some acts are so terrible, they leave permanent scars on the places where they occur. In the end, the poisoned wedding stands as one of history's darkest chapters. Not because of the number who died, other massacres have claimed more lives, but because of what it represented. This was civilization turned against itself. Hospitality transformed into murder. Joy perverted into horror. It was a moment when the thin veneer of culture and courtesy was stripped away to reveal the calculating brutality that can lurk beneath the final toast. At the wedding feast was, according to survivors, to eternal alliance and prosperity. The bitter irony of those words, spoken moments before the dying began, encapsulates the tragedy of Mont Blanc. Instead of alliance, there was betrayal. Instead of prosperity, there was death. Instead of a future bright with promise, there was only the darkness of the grave. For Isabella and Tierry, there would be no heir to carry on their joined bloodlines. No chance to prove that political marriages could become love matches. No opportunity to show that peace was possible between old enemies. They died as they had lived, as symbols rather than people, their individuality subsumed into the larger political narrative that had doomed them from the start. The poisoner, or poisoners, who orchestrated their deaths may have achieved their immediate political goals, but at what cost? They had shown that nothing was sacred, no bond unbreakable, no gathering safe from the reach of ambition. In seeking to prevent one future, they had created another, darker, more suspicious, less trusting. They had won their game, but poisoned the board for all future players. As we close this chronicle of one of history's most sinister events, we are left with questions that time has not answered. Who was ultimately responsible? What specific combination of poisons was used? How many conspiracies converged on that fatal day? These mysteries may never be solved, but perhaps that is fitting. The poisoned wedding remains a dark mirror reflecting not answers, but questions about human nature, political ambition, and the price of power. In the silence that followed the screams, in the emptiness where laughter had been, in the stillness of bodies that had danced just hours before, medieval Europe confronted a new reality. Trust, that most essential element of human society, had been revealed as potentially fatal. From that day forward, every cup raised in toast would carry the shadow of Malank. Every feast, the possibility of becoming a funeral. Every gathering of the powerful, a potential massacre. The wedding that was meant to unite two bloodlines had instead erased them. The feast that was meant to celebrate life had become a banquet of death. And in that transformation, in that perversion of joy into horror, we see reflected the darkest possibilities of political ambition, unchecked by human compassion. The poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry stands forever as a reminder that in the halls of power, trust can indeed be more lethal than swords, and that those who suck with ambition had best use a very long spoon.